85% of the trade between Canada and the United States is tariff-free. That's our exports to the United States, that's U.S. exports to Canada.
What is unfolding on grocery shelves in Alberta today is not a consumer trend, not a temporary protest, and not a political headline that will fade away next month, but a silent structural rupture in one of the most integrated trade relationships on the planet, one that could permanently cost the United States billions in lost agricultural exports. For decades, trade between the United States and Canada was treated as untouchable. It was stable, predictable, and mutually beneficial. Canadian supermarkets relied heavily on American produce, processed foods, and household staples. American farmers relied on Canada as a dependable, low-risk export market just across the border. This relationship survived recessions, political disagreements, and even past trade disputes. Over the past 7 months, grocery retailers in Alberta have quietly reduced or removed American products from their shelves, not because of a government ban, not because of supply shortages, but because they discovered they could operate without the United States and, in some cases, perform better. This shift did not happen overnight. It happened contract by contract, shipment by shipment, and decision by decision, driven by tariff uncertainty, political tension, and growing consumer resistance to American goods. For American farmers and exporters, the danger is not what happened last month. The danger is what happens next. Because once a market adapts away from the United States, it rarely comes back easily. And by the end of this analysis, you will see why Alberta's quiet move is not an isolated Canadian decision, but the early warning of a trade shock that could leave American farmers, exporters, and rural communities paying the price for years to come. What makes Alberta's shift truly alarming is not the loss of individual shipments, but the collapse of an assumption that shaped American trade strategy for generations. That Canada would always remain the safest, easiest, and most reliable buyer for United States goods. For American agriculture, Canada was never treated like a foreign market. It functioned as an extension of domestic demand. Crops were planted with Canadian buyers already in mind. Pricing models assumed frictionless access. Logistics networks were built around speed, not resilience. When demand slowed elsewhere in the world, Canada absorbed the excess. As Alberta retailers replaced United States suppliers, American producers did not receive formal warnings or renegotiation windows. Orders simply stopped coming. Forecasts became unreliable. Surplus inventories quietly grew. Price pressure intensified without a single headline announcing a crisis. This is how structural losses begin in modern trade wars, not with bans or emergency meetings, but with silence. By the time policymakers notice, the damage is already embedded in planting cycles, employment levels, and rural debt. The most dangerous part is this: Alberta did not suffer economic pain by stepping away. Costs stabilized, supply remained steady. Consumers adapted. And in the next section, we will expose why this successful adjustment may encourage other markets to follow the same path, creating a shock that the United States agricultural system is not prepared to absorb. The most underestimated risk in a modern trade war is not the headline tariff announcement. It is the silent reshaping of demand that follows, especially when a reliable buyer begins to behave like a temporary customer. That is the risk now facing the United States as Canada. Starting with Alberta retailers proves it can substitute away from American goods without suffering immediate shortages or price spikes. For a farmer, the loss of a stable nearby market is not just lost revenue. It is lost predictability, and predictability is what keeps farm finance working. Planting decisions are made months in advance. Labor schedules, equipment leasing, storage planning, and insurance assumptions all depend on forecasts that are never perfect but usually stable. Canada historically provided that stability because it was close, rules were familiar, logistics were fast, and relationships were long-standing. When Alberta buyers reduce orders, farmers face an ugly choice: sell into a saturated domestic market, store inventory longer than planned, or accept lower prices. Each option compresses margins. Storage is not free. Longer storage increases spoilage risk for many categories, increases energy use, and ties up cash that would otherwise cover wages, inputs, and loan payments. Discounting to move product quickly may preserve cash flow, but it can reset pricing expectations across the region, affecting neighbors and competitors who never sold to Canada directly. And that is where structural loss becomes contagious. Even producers who do not ship to Alberta can still feel the pressure when excess supply stays in the United States. In a trade war environment, demand shock does not remain neatly isolated. It spreads across distribution channels, squeezes processors, and forces wholesalers to push back on prices. This also increases dependence on government support, which is politically sensitive and economically destabilizing. When farmers lean more heavily on emergency assistance, it becomes harder for policymakers to claim that a tariff strategy is strengthening domestic production. It is difficult to argue for toughness when the result is more subsidy reliance and weaker rural balance sheets. Now layer tariffs on top of that. Tariffs create uncertainty that affects contracts. Many buyers do not want to sign long-term agreements when policies can change overnight. That is why a trade war does not only disrupt trade volumes, it disrupts the willingness to commit. Alberta retailers, operating on thin margins, have an incentive to avoid volatility. Once they find stable alternatives outside the United States, they reduce exposure to tariff risk, currency swings, and political headlines. Canada then becomes less sensitive to future tariffs because it has built redundancy. That makes the United States less influential, not more. This is the uncomfortable truth. A trade war can teach your partner how to live without you. And once Canada internalizes that lesson in a practical way through grocery procurement, that knowledge becomes permanent institutional memory. The United States can lower tariffs later, but it cannot easily restore the old sense of dependence. It is tempting to treat this story as a Canada-only issue, a regional boycott, a political dispute that hurts exporters and then fades. But the consequences can reach American households through the same channels that once made cross-border commerce efficient. When trade patterns shift, logistics networks reorganize. Routes that carried produce north may become less profitable and less frequent. Warehousing allocations change. Shipping schedules become less predictable. The system does not collapse overnight, but it becomes less optimized. In a high inflation environment, even modest inefficiencies can show up as higher costs, especially for categories that depend on fast movement and tight timing. At the same time, tariffs can contribute to price pressure inside the United States. When tariffs raise the cost of imported inputs or intermediate goods, those costs can appear downstream in packaging, transport, and processing. That is not ideology, it is arithmetic. A grocer does not absorb rising costs forever. A processor does not absorb them forever. Eventually, households notice through smaller discounts, fewer promotions, or higher shelf prices. For middle-aged and older viewers, the key issue is stability. People want to know whether the system that keeps food available and affordable is becoming more fragile. They also want to know whether policy choices are increasing uncertainty without delivering clear gains in jobs or wages. This story matters because it suggests that the United States may be losing leverage in a market that used to be almost automatic. Canada is not just any partner. Canada is geographically adjacent, deeply integrated, and culturally connected. If Canada can diversify away from United States suppliers quickly, other markets learn that the same is possible. That is the precedent risk. In a trade war, reputation becomes a form of currency. When buyers perceive the United States as a source of unpredictability, they do not wait for the next shock. They quietly build Plan B. And unlike a single canceled contract, Plan B tends to survive political cycles. New suppliers earn trust, new brands earn loyalty. And the longer American products remain absent from shelves, the harder it becomes to regain space, even if the United States later reduces tariffs or changes tone. Retail shelf space is not a neutral marketplace. It is a negotiated, relationship-driven ecosystem. Once another supplier is embedded, removing them creates risk for the retailer. Retailers prefer stability. In a trade war, stability is the prize. So the real question is not whether Alberta returns to American goods. The real question is how many other buyers inside Canada are already running the same playbook. and whether the United States is about to discover that the safest market it had is turning into a market that no longer needs it. In the next section, we are going to trace the supply chain evidence that suggests Alberta is only the first visible layer of a wider shift inside Canada, and we will reveal the overlooked data point that could indicate the United States is already losing the next stage of this market before most exporters have even updated their forecasts. One of the most misunderstood dynamics in a trade war is the difference between short-term pressure and long-term leverage. Tariffs can raise costs quickly, but leverage only exists if the other side lacks alternatives. What Alberta has demonstrated is that Canada is actively reducing that dependency, and in doing so, it is quietly changing the balance of power. For decades, policymakers in Washington assumed that geographic proximity guaranteed influence. The logic was simple. Canada was close, supply chains were integrated, and switching costs were high. That assumption shaped how the United States approached tariffs, negotiations, and rhetoric. Canada was treated as resilient, but ultimately captive to American supply. That assumption no longer holds. By diversifying suppliers across Latin America, Europe, and Asia, Canadian retailers are transforming dependence into optionality. Optionality is strategic power. It allows buyers to walk away from volatility without incurring immediate economic pain. Once that power shifts, tariffs lose much of their coercive value. Raising barriers no longer forces compliance, it accelerates substitution. This matters deeply for the United States because leverage once lost is rarely recovered through policy reversal alone. Even if tariffs are reduced or eliminated, trust does not automatically return. Canadian buyers now factor political unpredictability into procurement decisions. They ask not only about price and quality, but about headlines, elections, and executive statements. That is a new variable, and it disadvantages the United States. In practical terms, this means that future trade war threats aimed at Canada will land softer. Canadian firms know they can adapt. They have tested the system and found it flexible. That knowledge reshapes behavior permanently. It also sends a signal to other trading partners that diversification away from the United States is not just possible, but manageable. From a strategic standpoint, this is the opposite of deterrence. Instead of discouraging change, tariffs have accelerated it. Instead of reinforcing dependence, they have taught independence. The United States may still be a large supplier, but it is no longer viewed as irreplaceable. And when a country stops being irreplaceable, its negotiating position weakens across every table it sits at. Global trade does not operate in isolation. Markets watch each other closely, especially when a highly integrated partner like Canada successfully adjusts away from the United States without suffering visible disruption. Alberta's experience is being observed not as a political protest, but as a case study. For emerging exporters, this shift is an invitation. Latin American producers see expanded access not just as a temporary opening, but as a foothold. European suppliers view Canada as a test market for premium and specialty categories that once defaulted to American brands. Asian manufacturers interpret Alberta's sourcing changes as proof that North American retailers are willing to rethink long-established relationships if risk becomes too high. This global response matters because it compounds the original loss. The United States is not only losing sales, it is losing future positioning. Every new supplier that enters Canada builds experience, logistics, familiarity, and regulatory confidence. Over time, those suppliers become competitive not only on price, but on reliability. That is how long-term displacement happens. There's also a reputational dimension that should concern policymakers in Washington. Trade partners are beginning to separate economic capability from political reliability. The United States remains a powerful producer, but it is increasingly perceived as volatile. In global trade, volatility is expensive. Buyers pay a premium for predictability. When predictability declines, buyers diversify even if it costs more in the short term. This perception risk extends beyond Canada. Other allies may quietly adopt similar diversification strategies, not as retaliation, but as insurance. Insurance does not require confrontation, it requires preparation. And preparation often looks like reduced exposure. For American exporters, this creates a difficult reality. They may not see an immediate collapse in sales, but they may notice slower growth, tougher negotiations, shorter contracts, and more aggressive price demands. Those are early warning signs of declining influence. The most troubling aspect is that none of this requires hostile intent. Canada does not need to oppose the United States openly. It simply needs to optimize for stability. And in a trade war environment, stability increasingly points away from reliance on a single dominant supplier. In the next section, we will examine the long-term strategic consequences of this shift and reveal why the United States may be approaching a point where reversing course is no longer enough to restore its former position, even if tariffs are rolled back and tensions cool. One of the deepest risks in the current trade war is the assumption that economic pressure automatically produces political compliance. History suggests otherwise. When pressure becomes persistent and unpredictable, it does not force submission. It encourages redesign. The United States has long relied on its scale to shape outcomes. Large markets, large demand, and large production capacity were expected to translate into leverage. But leverage only works when access is scarce. What Alberta has revealed is that access to the United States is no longer perceived as scarce enough to justify enduring instability. Tariffs were introduced with the expectation that pain would be asymmetric. The theory was that Canada would feel pressure faster and more acutely. Instead, the opposite dynamic emerged. Canadian retailers internalized risk and redesigned supply chains. American producers, bound by planting cycles and capital investments, absorbed the shock more slowly but more deeply. This asymmetry is critical. A retailer can change suppliers within months. A farmer cannot change crops or markets at the same speed. In a trade war, speed matters. The faster actor gains flexibility. The slower actor absorbs losses. Another miscalculation lies in the belief that reversing tariffs automatically restores relationships. Trade relationships are not switches. They are habits. Once habits change, reversion is costly. Buyers demand discounts, guarantees, and flexibility that did not exist before. Trust, once weakened, must be purchased again, often at a premium. For the United States, this means that even a policy correction may not stop the erosion. Canadian buyers now factor political volatility into long-term risk assessments. That variable does not disappear when one administration changes its tone. It becomes embedded in corporate governance and procurement policy. This is how strategic influence decays without dramatic failure. The United States remains strong, but less central, less automatic, less assumed. That shift does not trigger alarms immediately, but it compounds over time. In this sense, the trade war risks achieving the opposite of its stated goals. Instead of strengthening domestic resilience, it increases dependence on support mechanisms. Instead of forcing alignment, it accelerates diversification. And instead of restoring control, it teaches partners how to operate independently. The danger is not that the United States loses one province. The danger is that it loses the assumption of indispensability. The consequences of this shift extend far beyond export statistics. They move through the economy in ways that affect everyday life inside the United States. When agricultural exports weaken, employment does not collapse immediately, it erodes. Fewer seasonal workers are hired, maintenance is deferred, equipment upgrades are postponed. Over time, this reduces productivity and competitiveness. Rural communities feel the strain first, but the effects ripple outward. Lower farm income reduces spending in local economies. Retail, services, and transportation sectors contract quietly. Young workers leave, tax bases shrink, public services face pressure. This is not theoretical. It is the historical pattern of prolonged agricultural stress. At the consumer level, tariffs and trade friction can introduce price instability. Even when headline inflation appears controlled, volatility increases, promotions become less frequent, product variety narrows, substitution becomes more common. For older households on fixed incomes, unpredictability matters as much as price level. Stability is a form of economic security. Politically, this creates a feedback loop. Trade policy meant to project strength begins to generate domestic dissatisfaction. Voters ask why allies are pulling away. Farmers ask why support payments are rising. Consumers ask why prices feel less predictable. The narrative becomes harder to control. The most uncomfortable truth is this: structural trade losses rarely announce themselves. They show up years later as lost opportunity. Markets that once grew no longer do. Competitors that once lagged catch up. Influence that once felt permanent becomes conditional. Alberta's decision may seem local, but its implications are systemic. It challenges the assumption that the United States can apply pressure without consequence. It suggests that in a world of flexible supply chains, pressure teaches adaptation faster than obedience. And that raises the most dangerous question of all. If Canada, one of the closest and most integrated partners of the United States, can quietly reduce dependence without suffering visible harm, how many other markets are already preparing to do the same? In the next section, we will confront the uncomfortable possibility that the United States has already crossed a threshold where restoring the old trade order is no longer possible, and we will reveal the strategic twists that could define the next phase of this trade war. There is a moment in every trade war when the central problem stops being escalation and becomes irreversibility. The evidence now emerging from Canada suggests the United States may be approaching that moment. Once supply chains are rebuilt, contracts rewritten, and consumer habits reshaped, restoring the old trade order requires more than policy adjustment. It requires convincing buyers to accept renewed risk. Alberta retailers have already internalized a hard lesson. Dependence on the United States introduces political exposure that alternative suppliers do not. Even if tariffs are eased, that lesson does not disappear. For American exporters, this creates a structural disadvantage. They must now offer more than competitive pricing. They must offer reassurance against future volatility. That often means shorter contracts, lower margins, and greater concessions. In other words, the cost of doing business rises precisely as leverage falls. This is the strategic twist few anticipated. The trade war was designed to increase negotiating power. Instead, it has forced partners like Canada to redesign systems in ways that permanently reduce sensitivity to United States pressure. The result is not confrontation, but insulation. Once insulation exists, threats lose effectiveness. The most dangerous misreading in Washington may be the belief that Canada's adjustment is limited to one province or one sector. In reality, Alberta serves as proof of concept. It demonstrates that diversification is operationally possible, politically acceptable, and economically survivable. That proof travels fast. Other buyers, both inside Canada and beyond, do not need to announce their intentions. They only need to quietly adjust sourcing ratios, shorten commitments, and build redundancy. None of this triggers headlines, but collectively, it rewrites demand. For the United States, this creates a dilemma. Escalation accelerates adaptation. De-escalation may come too late to reverse it. The window where pressure could be applied without teaching independence may already have closed. And that leads to a sobering realization. The next phase of this trade war may not be fought through tariffs or negotiations at all. It may be fought through absence, through missing orders, through markets that simply stop calling. In the final section, we will confront what this means for the United States economy going forward and ask whether American policymakers are prepared for a world where influence is no longer assumed, but must be rebuilt from a position of diminished necessity. What began as a quiet sourcing adjustment in Alberta now stands as a warning signal for the broader trade war strategy of the United States. This is not a story about punishment or retaliation. It is a story about adaptation. Canada did not collapse under pressure. It recalibrated, and in doing so, it exposed a vulnerability that tariffs alone cannot fix. The United States remains a powerful economy with unmatched productive capacity. But power in modern trade is no longer defined only by size. It is defined by reliability, predictability, and trust. When partners begin designing systems that function without American inputs, the United States loses something more valuable than market share. It loses default status. For American farmers, exporters, and rural communities, this shift carries long-term consequences. Lost markets are difficult to reclaim. Habits once broken do not easily reform. And in a global economy where alternatives are plentiful, buyers rarely return out of nostalgia. The critical question now is not whether the trade war can be adjusted, but whether it has already reshaped behavior in ways that policy can no longer fully reverse. Is this a bold strategy that will eventually strengthen the United States, or a risky mistake that teaches partners how to move on without it? If you value clear data, careful reasoning, and an honest examination of global trade dynamics, this is where those conversations continue.